As Pavan said, that I'm going to be talking about the links between biodiversity and the provision of ecosystem services and what lies underneath them. And I'm going to start by showing you some biodiversity. The world is very rich in biodiversity. We have fantastic biodiversity, but these also produce ecosystem services that we enjoy, and they're doing so now, in fact. And I'm not talking about the provision of air that we can breathe or temperature conducive to life. I'm talking about this slide is giving you ecosystem services because research has shown that merely looking at an image of the environment reduces stress and reduces workplace arguments and things like that. So actually you're receiving an ecosystem service now from this. And the underpinning the ecosystem services are the biodiversity, and sometimes we don't notice that. And ecosystem services provide things that we don't notice. Like, who has ever wondered why we are not very deep in all the residue from all the species that have ever existed for 3.7 billion years? Ecosystem services have a range of activities. From the top left there, let me get this cursor, top left there are fossil stromatolites. These are the things that we believe first created oxygen on the planet 2.5 billion years ago. And the examples are still around today. They are living stromatolites. They are pads of blue-green algae which produce oxygen, bubbles up from them. The picture in the middle, the green one, is other species of algae producing bubbles of oxygen you can see there. On the top right, the bacteria are a particular group of bacteria, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They take nitrogen, which comprises nearly 80% of the atmosphere, but is inert and unavailable to plants. They convert that into nitrate and ammonium that plants can use. And when we eat plants, or we eat the animals that eat the plants, that nitrogen goes into our system, it goes into our DNA, goes into our proteins and amino acids. That's enough of them. And that's how we survive. So we wouldn't be here without things like that, ecosystem services provided by effectively invisible organisms. At the bottom there, we've got provisioning services where we have timber and we have fish that are provided directly to us and we use them in the market. But we don't actually look after our environments that well. We destroy the ecosystems that provide the services. This is the rainforest area of Borneo and how it's reduced in the last 60 years and projected to continue to be reduced by human activities. And it brings into debate the sustainability of our economic model that our existence is based on, our economic existence is based on. We are destroying the things that keep us wealthy. And that is really the purpose of TEEB, to try and bring those things out into the open. Now this is a paper you might have recognized from Nature in 2009, Rockström et al. From the Stockholm Resilience Institute. They did a survey of the impacts of humanity on planetary homeostasis. They decided that since the last ice age, the Earth has been fairly equable for life. And we are now putting strain on that, which is putting that homeostasis in jeopardy. And of the things that they recognized, and I'll just mention that this green border here is what they regard as the safe limits of these things. Biodiversity, on the left here, is hemorrhaging from the planet. We are losing biodiversity at about 1,000 times the natural background rate of loss. As everybody knows, as nearly everybody knows, we're pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a rate which is making the planetary temperature unsustainable. And we're also producing so much phosphorus and nitrogen particularly, but phosphorus is nearly up to the limit, that we're fertilizing the broader environment. We use nitrogen and phosphorus to add to our crops so that we can grow more crops and more cheaply, but that's leaking into the broader environment and causing problems of what they call eutrophication, overwhelming the natural systems. So I'm going to talk about these things, ecosystem dynamics, how biodiversity leads to functioning in ecosystems, how functioning produces the services that we benefit in and we get benefits from. And so the lecture is divided into 5 sections, which are broadly in line with the chapter 2 of the D0 document. And I'm going to go first through these, the biodiversity and ecosystem section. So we know from studies such as Hooper et al., which is on the reading list, that high biodiversity increases productivity in an ecosystem. The more species that you have within an ecosystem, the greater the production of primary production, that's growth of plants and algae and so on, and secondary production, that's animals that eat the plants, so that we can expect greater productivity in line with how many species are there. It also brings greater variation in species. The more species there are, the more chances that they will have different characteristics from each other. And that's very important with something called response diversity. When an ecosystem is put under pressure from an external driver, like an invasive species, population growing, or temperature change, or eutrophication, this fertilization of nitrogen, phosphorus, the different species comprising the ecosystem react differently. They handle that in different ways, so that if some of them are lost, then other species can continue the function. The other thing that high biodiversity leads to is a greater chance of having keystone species. Keystone species are unusual species in that they have a very great effect on the ecosystem. A typical example, much cited, is the beaver. If you have 2 ecosystems, one of which has beavers, then you're going to have water, lakes, dams, and wetland processes going on in that ecosystem that you won't have in the one without the beaver. And so that's a characteristic of that ecosystem from one species, which is unusual. So it brings me to the question that I should have asked in the beginning, which is, what is biodiversity? And the BBC did a survey amongst various cities in England, in Britain, when the TEEB D0 document was published. It was on the news, and they did a survey, and they asked people what they thought biodiversity was. And I wonder if anyone can guess what the top answer was from the highly educated British public. Anyone have a guess?
The number of species.
Number of species. Not remotely close. The top answer was a washing powder. And that really ought to spell out the level of ignorance there. You thought of that because you knew. But in fact, what it tells me is that it's up to us. It's up to people prepared to study this. Economists, ecologists, academics, policymakers. It's up to us to solve the problems of biodiversity and the fact that we depend on them for so much. And we've got to somehow convince the great British public and other publics that it's not a washing powder. What biodiversity is, I've tried to put the gist of it on this slide here. It is the diversity of species, the number of species, the number of organisms that in one species, and the genes that they have within them, and the genetic variability of that. It's the interactions between species and other species, and between individuals in the same species, and between species and their abiotic environment. That's the non-living environment, minerals and water and so on. And particularly, it's about the resources they use and the wastes they produce, and how those wastes are resources for other organisms. It's flows, as I put at the bottom. And I was pondering how to explain this, because I know some people here are not ecologists by training, how to explain what an ecosystem is and what biodiversity contributes. When I was cleaning out an area of my backyard which I'd neglected for a few weeks, and I moved the red sack there, and underneath I found an ecosystem, which I wasn't expecting to see, although perhaps I should have done. Adjacent to it on the concrete slab there was nothing, but underneath that there was an area of mud and some worms and centipedes and woodlice and little thrashing nematodes and so on. If I'd thought quicker, I would have got my camera before I actually disrupted the ecosystem. But they are some of the components of it. And what I was looking at was the provision of ecosystem services. And the ecosystem services they provided were waste removal, because the detritus, the leaves and dust particles and so on that had been blown under the bag, and combined with the rain running down the bag, had provided the basis for waste removal. That had been gone. Nutrient cycling, because one of the things that growing there was a piece of grass growing out to the side, and soil formation. There was quite a quantity of soil formed under that bag that had been there for about 1 month. So what I did was drew a little diagram. It's not as complicated as it seems. I'll get the pointer again. If you have a look, the inblown material, that's leaves and bits of dust and so on, and the rain, combine with the things that eat it, that is earthworms and woodlice particularly. They eat that stuff and they excrete it, which is a frass, and they make a high surface area and suitable conditions for colonization of that material by fungi and bacteria. The fungi and bacteria mineralize the nutrients. That means they take the nutrients that are there in the tissues of those waste material and render them available for plants, so they support the growth of the grass, which is growing up the side. In addition, there was a centipede, which is a predator of earthworms, nematodes, which are parasites and also they're herbivores as well, so they would have been eaten by the slug, and they would have also parasitized the slug, and the bacteria they eat, and so on. So there are interactions. All these lines are interactions between the species, and I've got here on the right the list of what they do. The detritus and water was the first thing that came in. The consumption and excretion, that was waste removal, removing that material that was coming in. Then the colonization by fungi and bacteria. And then mineralization of the nutrients, which is nutrient cycling, another ecosystem service which increases fertility. And then support for primary reduction, that was the soil themselves, all in one little space underneath the sac. Importantly, it's the interaction of the lines that are the processes and functions that are occurring naturally within an ecosystem that lead to the provision of ecosystem services, the way these things interact with each other. Now, if you think of any ecosystem outside, a woodland, a meadow, a pond or something, there will be not a dozen species, there will be hundreds of species there, all interacting and working the minerals and the resources and wastes and so on. And that will give you some idea of what an ecosystem actually is, very simply. Okay, so if we move on to a typical ecosystem, say a meadow, we can talk about the second aspect of biodiversity, which is genetic, because within those wild species of plants, there may be relatives of cultivars that we recognize, like wheat and carrot and so on. And any one of those species contains a variety of genes and characteristics of every different trait, just the same as we do in this room. We have people with brown eyes and blue eyes and long legs and short legs. Some people that are resistant to particular diseases, some people that are susceptible to them, and so on. Every characteristic, we have genes for it in great variety, and so do the plants. And when you have, say for example, this meadow has a very wet patch over here, or a very dry patch, the species and the individuals of the same species that exist in that patch with different conditions will be the ones that have the genes that are suited to that. They'll have tolerance of wetter conditions or dry conditions, or if there's an agricultural field, they might have resistance to the effects of invasive species, to exotic species. And they will be the ones there that grow in that point. And there's a very good example of this on chapter 2, which I know you will have a copy, on page 64, of rice, which were in the Indian subcontinent. There were some periods of extensive flooding, and when in heavily flooded years, the rice grew too long and tipped over, and the crop was lost to rot. But somebody spotted in related species, in the wild species of rice, that some of them existed in a wetter area that was permanently or wet for long periods, that it didn't have the same problems. So by breeding the genes of the wild species into the cultivated species, the Oryza sativa that we grow, a cultivar was developed eventually that had the tolerance, had the crop and the yield of the cultivated rice and the tolerance to flooding of the wild species. And without the wild species being present if they had been eradicated because of agricultural expansion or so on, or herbicides, then those genes would not have been available. So that's a lesson in why the genetic variation, and not just the number of species, is important for the preservation of ecosystem functioning and then ecosystem services. So the end of section 1, just to recap, this is what I want you to take away from this. That an ecosystem is a very complex series of interactions, a network of interactions, both among the species themselves and between the species and their abiotic, their non-living environment. The more species they have, the higher the biodiversity, the greater range of interactions there are going to be, the greater range of responses to external stimuli and pressures. So you've got more chances of the ecosystem persisting in adverse conditions with the more species. So that's a greater range of traits. And lastly, the thing I mentioned at the beginning, that increased biodiversity means increased productivity. Okay, so section 2, ecosystem functions and functional groups. Now, it's quite important to recognize that ecosystem services that we rely on for the benefits they give us rely on functions which are a natural part of the ecosystem. And they are provided by groups, unless you have an individual keystone species like a beaver I was mentioning before, they rely on groups of organisms that do the same thing or roughly the same thing or the same thing in different ways. So for example, at the top there you have water plants. They naturally take up nutrients from the water column, nitrogen, phosphorus and so on, that helps them grow. In doing so, they remove those chemicals from the water column. And that means that we have clean water coming out the end. Very important for biodiversity itself, for our aesthetic enjoyment, very important for water companies that have got to pay to clean water for us to consume, and so on. The same with soil microbes. Soil microbes, as we saw in the example from my backyard, they recycle nutrients, and that gives us fertility for other organisms to grow, primary production, which is done by terrestrial plants. They provide food for us and for animals. Arthropods, for example, spiders, prey on other animals. That's their function. So that provides a service of removing pests. So, for example, spiders eat a lot of aphids that infest wheat, and wheat fields can be protected from the aphids by the spiders. Other arthropods, like insects, for example, by consuming nectar, they pollinate our plants. So they're done by groups of species, and importantly, when one species is affected by an outside force, by climate change, by eutrophication, by invasive species and so on, some species may succumb to it, but others won't, and so that provides continuation of the function, and that comes from biodiversity. So functional groups perform the functions nearly always, not individuals, and different species perform the same function in different ways. So if you take soil microbes, for example, some of them will make nitrate, some of them will make ammonium, and so on. They'll contribute to the function in different ways. That's why that the ecosystem change need not lead to the loss of ecosystem service. Okay, this is an example of how functional groups respond to biodiversity. So the blue disc at the top there represents one species in its environment, in its niche. And the top line is a functional group with few species in it. So it's got few species and it will produce the function, but the functioning will not be to the full potential. It'll have reduced functioning. If you take the same ecosystem in the middle there, you have a larger number of species in the functional group, so greater biodiversity in that functional group, and they provide the full complement of processes to form the function, so the functioning is increased. If in a highly biodiverse system represented by the bottom you have far more species, the functioning will then not be increased further because every base will be covered by the middle section, so that the extra species there will not increase functioning. So the functional group is full, if you like. And so they are called redundant. We call them redundant species or functionally redundant species. But that actually is a misnomer because they should be seen as a sort of insurance. So if an environmental driver comes along to take out some of the species, there should be enough species. The more species there are, the more species there are to continue the functioning. And as humans, we won't notice the difference in ecosystem service provision because there are species there to replace those that have been lost or stressed or reduced function, etc. Having said that, a friend of mine in France, Michel Coste, who works on microalgae in rivers, tiny microscopic plants, diatoms, he found 3,000 different species of diatoms which all do the same thing in rivers in France. So I believe that maybe some are spare after all, unless they would be more resilient perhaps. The other thing about functional groups is that some of them are linked. In fact, frequently there are what we call bundles. Someone's called bundles of ecosystem services. This is where the same process, the same functioning or the same ecosystem produces a series of ecosystem services. So that, for example, the example I've used there is an intact woodland will produce all those and other ecosystem services. It'll produce pollinators for local crops. It'll produce birds that we enjoy seeing, and they will eat some of the pests from crops and so on, or from your garden. It'll clean water, it'll store carbon, and it'll provide timber and fibre and animals that we might use or enjoy looking at. So if something happens to cause an impact on that functioning of that ecosystem, the suite of ecosystem services, the bundle of ecosystem services are then threatened. So we've got to think about the integrity of the ecosystem and the health of the ecosystem in order to maintain ecosystem services. The other links are trade-offs. And this is a very important concept to understand. The provision of one ecosystem service can lead to the reduced provision of other ecosystem services. This is particularly in managed systems. So if we, for example, talk about a farmer who's growing potatoes on a field or something, as he increases the specialization of the habitat, in other words, he intensively manages that land to grow his crop and a high yield of potatoes, he will lose other ecosystem services. And I can show you that by following line A, which is the typical response of ecosystem services to intensification. So if you can imagine, when the area of land is wild, it has high provision of ecosystem services. That's lots of biodiversity, a lot of plant species and animal species. And when it's intensively managed, there'll be few. So what happens is the farmer comes along and he clears the land. So that, first of all, will reduce a lot of the species to about there, perhaps. Then he will add fertilizer, and that will reduce it again to perhaps there, because a lot of species, most species, are evolved for low nutrient conditions. And that's because there are a lot of species all competing for the nutrients, and the ones that demand a lot of nutrients get removed. When the farmer comes along and adds nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer to his soil, he's doing that because he wants to promote the growth of species that respond well to high fertilizers, in this case, potatoes. So when he does so, the other species will disappear, so there's a greater loss. Then he will add maybe a herbicide, and that'll reduce it further. He does that to get rid of weed species which are competing with his crop. And again, a pesticide to remove the animals that are possibly eating his crop. So by the time he's done that, he's got a very nice high yield of potatoes, but there are no other ecosystem services being produced. Now, that's the typical response for line A. Line B and line C represent management to maintain the provision of regulating ecosystem services, those on the left, the y-axis, to increase the provision of those whilst maintaining a decent crop of his potatoes. And this can be done through management. For example, if he's an organic farmer, he will have more species. He might leave areas of wild habitat and so on. That will provide the pollinators and the predators and so on. And in extreme management, you can get very high provision of other ecosystem services while still maintaining quite a high yield. Of course, he can't get his very high yields and have all the ecosystem services at the same time, but we'll come back to that one. So this, you might recognize this from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It's where they categorized ecosystem services into supporting, on the left there, supporting, provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. Now, the provisioning ecosystem services are the things that we can sell in the market. Their food, their timber, and so on. The cultural ecosystem services at the bottom there are things that we sort of take for granted and we think they're not very important. But in fact, they're the reason that make life worth living, actually, the cultural ecosystem services. And the regulating ecosystem services, and also the supporting ones that bring them up, are the things that keep the habitat fit for life, fit for providing the provisioning ecosystem services, which are the target of the farmer's activity. So without the regulating and supporting ecosystem services, he can't grow that food. So they are just as important as the provisioning ecosystem services, but you can't sell them in the market. So, yeah, provisioning services are short-term, and the others are more sort of indirect. So if we go back to this graph of the trade-offs, here you have the farmer increasing the intensification of management in order to maximize his yield. But here we have the need to maintain the regulating ecosystem services to enable the farmer to continue to do that in the future. So he might have to perhaps forego some of the high yield of his crop, where his profits are and his ability to maintain his business, in order to maintain the provision of the regulating ecosystem services. So you can see why the farmer might not be that keen on maintaining the regulating ecosystem services. He's more interested in staying in business next year. You can't blame him for that. So if they have to forego some of that, they need to be compensated for it. Now, the consequences of losing regulating ecosystem services are complex and manifold. At the top in black and white, we have the 1930s Dust Bowl in the States, where ecosystem services were ignored entirely and the consequences were disastrous. In the middle, that is a mangrove swamp, which is a coastal forest of particular plants that have these aerial roots, and they can tolerate flooding in the tidal zone and so on. They are frequently replaced by shrimp farms, and in doing so, the local people who survived from the fish and the nursery services of that ecosystem, the mangrove swamp, where the fish that they catch out at sea spend their juvenile stages in those swamps, they are lost. And hence this chap advertising his book, Let Them Eat Shrimp, because typically it's a outside corporation which takes the land, converts it to shrimp production. Some of the local people manage to get a job growing shrimps, of course, but most of them lose their ecosystem services that was their subsistence living. And also on there, of course, we have ecosystem services loss, which leads to poverty in extreme cases. Some of that's in Darfur in the Horn of Africa, ecosystem service related. And this is Hurricane Katrina, where again ecosystem services, mangrove swamps particularly, would have protected some of the land around there. In the Asian tsunami in 2005 Christmas, areas where the mangrove swamp had been reduced and removed in favour of things like that were devastated. The villages behind were devastated. Where the mangroves were intact, villages were intact. So that's the sort of difference it can make to lives and the economy. Okay, other examples are the Amazon basin in the droughts. The drought caused the deoxygenation of the water and massive fish kills. That had profound effects on the local people. In the Arctic, at the present time, the sea ice is becoming, well, there's a debate whether this year will be the lowest area of sea ice. But it has been progressing, if you look at the graph at the top there, progressively getting lower over the last few decades. And someone's put these regression lines in which are showing that the date of free ice is getting closer and closer. I think that hopefully that's the worst case scenario. But when it happens, people will go up there getting oil, of course. And I just added that because you always get a picture of a polar bear when you're talking about the Arctic. So I thought I'm going to go one further and have a baby polar bear. So enjoy that, because you might as well twang the heartstrings if you can. Okay, so back to trade-offs. In the chapter 2 and in other documents such as this European assessment, they're talking about trade-offs in the sense that managing for one ecosystem service risks reducing other services such as biodiversity, pollination, disease regulation, and so on. And that is a fact. That's what happens. But it need not happen if the environment can be managed intelligently. So I've got a couple of examples here in a tree plantation. In Britain, we've got, particularly in Wales and Scotland, actually, in the northwest, timber plantations, where it's a monoculture of Sitka spruce or a monoculture of larch or something like that, made for industrial reasons. And they are clear-felled every 30 or 40 years. So while they're there, they provide other services like air conditioning services, they clean water, and they protect against flooding, because woodland soils are very absorbent, like a sponge, and they can protect downstream towns from flooding in heavy rain periods. So, but these are reversed when the timber is cut every 35 years or whatever it is, depending on species. So they provide timber every 30 or 40 years, and they provide these other services after the new trees are about 5 years old until they're felled. Compare that with a natural woodland ecosystem, and they provide the same services: timber, air conditioning, clean water, flood protection, but they also provide a lot of other ecosystem services, from food, medicines, animals, plants, carbon storage, recreational value, lots of other ecosystem services. Now, can tree plantations be managed on woodland sustainable lines? Well, yes, they can. There are examples of it, some of them in the States, where a former tree plantation was managed to remove timber yearly, and other plants were allowed to grow. And what happened was that the timber, during that cycle of 30 to 40 years of the clear fell, the amount of timber, the revenue from the timber, was the same as it had been in the other ecosystem, the other monocultural ecosystem. So the timber revenue was the same, but it provided these services all the time. So now that woodland is trees of multi-age structure, and lots of other species in between. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so, and more so in this, when you've clear felled a tree plantation, the soil frequently washes away into local streams, fills them up with silt and all the nutrients and so on. If you're interested in that, you ought to look up the story of Hubbard Brook Experimental Station, where they cleared an entire catchment. Okay, so we'll move on to another system, the agriculture that we talked about before. The regulating ecosystem services that we want to promote, they depend on vegetation, but the agriculture has vegetation, so why does it remove those ecosystem services? Well, it does so because of ploughing reduces soil carbon, and it reduces the biodiversity. The use of pesticides reduces biodiversity. The application of pesticides and fertilizer and so on compacts the soil and damages the soil ecology. The fertilizer that they add, being chemical, adds no organic matter, so that doesn't enhance the soil ecology either. And also they add indirectly to climate change, of course. And the fertilizer increases the runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus. And by that I mean the farmer applies phosphorus and nitrogen to the ground to fertilize the crops. It rains, and quite a proportion of his expensive fertilizer washes off the land and runs into the local water body or adjacent ecosystems. And that adds to the problems of those ecosystems as well. Fertilizer also increases the emissions of methane and nitrous oxide to greenhouse gases. And if you just remember the other slide I showed you before of the planetary boundaries, where we're threatening the homeostasis of the planet, these are biodiversity, which we've mentioned here, climate change, which we're mentioning here, and nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, which we're talking about here. So agriculture adds to all of those things that we've decided we need to really get a hold on and bring them under control. Okay, so can the agriculture be managed in sustainable ways? Well, we can use organic agriculture, but that sometimes leads to the same problems, particularly of nutrient runoff. But the use of the particular type of plough, the keyline plough, which lifts the soil rather than turns it over, the use of that increases the soil carbon because it incorporates vegetation matter, and it also increases the nutrient availability in the soil. And management specifically for water and for nutrients can reduce the need for applying fertilizer and applying irrigation from the local rivers and so on. Additions of organic matter increases biodiversity, including those things that are good for the farmer. And things like new ideas like addition of charcoal, crushed charcoal to the soil, adds carbon to the soil, it increases nutrient availability and then store of nutrients, and it increases water retention, which reduces the need for irrigation, and it does that while increasing yields. So these things can be done. It doesn't have to be quite such a stark contrast in the trade-offs between the provision of the target, the potatoes in our case, and the provision of the regulating ecosystem services. You can maintain these services up here, regulating and supporting ecosystem services by intelligent farming without reducing the total yield of the target crop very much. And there are examples where the total yield has been increased by intelligent farming whilst maintaining those ecosystem services. So it's not a simple trade-off that it first appears. Okay, that's the end of section 2. So you need to understand that groups of organisms, not individual organisms, provide these functions that lead to the ecosystem services that we benefit from. Increased biodiversity is a sort of insurance which leads to the continued provision of ecosystem services even when the environment is under stress. Intensive management for one ecosystem service can lead to, or frequently leads to, reduction of other ecosystem services, and the consequences of which are very serious, but we can get round these trade-offs by intelligent management of the soil and better farming practices. Okay, section 3 is a sort of critical thing to understand. It's about resilience of ecosystems, how ecosystems are resistant to outside pressures, how they respond to outside pressures, and why particularly an ecosystem may suddenly change to a permanently degraded state. And the pressures on ecosystems from human activity and human numbers include climate change, introduced species, eutrophication, that's this fertilization of the environment I'm talking about, and they have direct effects on the ecosystem and how it functions. So resilient ecosystems are ecosystems that can withstand some of those pressures, and they can either withstand them and so you don't notice them in the provision of ecosystem services, or if they are hit, they recover quickly. So a resilient ecosystem service is one that can withstand being buffeted by external shocks. That continues the ecosystem service provision. And if you remember from before, the increased biodiversity increases the range of responses, and that's why the ecosystem can have greater resistance and resilience. Now, when you have an environmental driver, such as temperature rise, eutrophication, or so on, there is a linear response. The ecosystem will respond in a linear way. In other words, it's recoverable while the environmental driver is not too strong. But if there is a certain point, a threshold point is reached, then that ecosystem can flip to a completely different state, a degraded state. And this graph here is a hysteresis graph. You might have seen it before. It describes the response of an ecosystem to environmental driver. So I'm going to use the cursor again. Along the bottom here, we have the increasing environmental driver, which, as I say, could be populations of invasive species from exotic places, temperature, or eutrophication. The ecosystem can exist in two separate states. It can exist up here in this state, which is the pristine state or the high quality state, and it can exist down here, which is the degraded state. So we have state A and state B that they can exist in. And this one is the high quality state that produces the ecosystem services that we need, and the degraded state doesn't. So we have got an interest in keeping the ecosystem in this particular state here. Now, if we take nutrients as an example, this is low nutrients at this end, increasing nutrients, and very high nutrients here. And the ecosystem exists, as I say, on this line. So where there are low nutrients, the ecosystem will be in its pristine, high-quality state, providing ecosystem services for us. As the environmental driver increases, the trajectory of the ecosystem will follow this line until it reaches this point here, this fold, and at that point, the concentrations or the environmental driver is so strong that it will suddenly flip to this state here where it is stable and degraded. Until it reaches that point, if the environmental driver is reducing, it will progress back along the line, so it will recover and become more stable. If it goes past that point, it will flip to this degraded state. And crucially, if the environmental driver reduces, once it's in this state, it will follow this line. So in other words, it will stay in the degraded state. It won't flip up to the high quality state again. That's very important economically, because if an ecosystem moves to the degraded state, it can't be repaired again without a lot of effort and a lot of expense. So, yes, that thing flashed then. What that represents is the fact that between these two vertical red lines, the two folds, the ecosystem can be in either state under the same external nutrient conditions, or environmental driver. So although it's uniquely pristine here and uniquely degraded here, between these two vertical lines, it can flip from one to the other. And it can do that when another environmental shock disrupts the stabilizing mechanisms which are inherent in the ecosystem. Okay, so there's a line which is what we might expect in response to the increasing driver. As the driver, the eutrophication in our example, continues, why doesn't the state of the ecosystem follow that straight line? So if anyone can offer an answer to that, I'll be very impressed. But I don't expect you to. The reason it doesn't is because it is held in these two states by stabilizing mechanisms, which are feedbacks. And they are normal processes inherent to the ecosystem which are suited to that state, and they keep it in that state. So when it's in this separate degraded state, another set of stabilizing mechanisms hold it in that state. So that's why it doesn't follow that diagonal line there, I've done the dashed line. And importantly, as the environmental driver moves along, the distance between the state where the ecosystem is actually held and the state where the environmental driver wants it to be, it grows in intensity. So there becomes a tension in this area, and the further along the environmental driver is, the greater the tension is from where the ecosystem is and where the environmental driver is sending it, trying to send it. So if something then disrupts these stabilizing mechanisms, then it will flip suddenly into this degraded state. And the same thing can happen backwards, but the chances of it going are increased as the nutrients are reduced again. So if you're managing an ecosystem to try to get it back into the pristine state, you need to get your nutrients or your environmental driver right back down as low as you can, because you've got a better chance of flipping it back. Okay, so the stabilizing mechanisms are things in the ecosystem which are feedbacks, which hold it in that state. Okay, so I'm going to, did I just miss something there? Yeah, I've explained that. The shock increases, so if an external shock, so something coming to remove one component of the ecosystem that's a key component, if it shocks it, it can then move it from either to one state to the other. But it's going to go there anyway if the driver reaches up this end. Okay, here's an example of that happening. The one I'm looking at now is a lake. This is looking down into a clear freshwater lake in the water, and you can see there's quite a lot of different species of plants there. In there are a lot of snails and invertebrates, water fleas, which are the things that eat the microscopic algae, and fish, and so on, all living there in multi-species. That produces ecosystem services for us. So that dirty water entering this lake will leave clean. In fact, a lake that I was working on was in this state, and next to it was another lake that was in this state. This is the microscopic algae grown to such density that they shade out the plants and the plants die. So that is the degraded state, and that is the pristine state of the same ecosystem. It's what it can move into. Dirty water entering this will come out just as dirty, or dirtier still, because there'll be toxins from blue-green algae and so on. The lake that I was mentioning, when the water like this, which is like pea soup, flowed in high quantity into the clean ecosystem, you could see it evaporating like steam as this highly dense algae was diluted into the water, and the stability of this ecosystem and the feedback mechanisms, for example, the zooplankton which eat this stuff particularly, was such that it wasn't affected by this high input of algae and didn't destabilize it. And that's because of those buffers that stabilize the ecosystem in one state. So this can flip. You can have a switch, a shock. So something, for example, in this instance that might remove the plants, that's runoff of herbicides, for example, or a lot of boat traffic, which will grind the plants up, can convert it into this state while we're between those two vertical folds on that graph I showed you. So between those, that's the sort of thing that can flip it up. Returning it to that state again is very expensive, very time-consuming, and nearly always ultimately futile. It has been done, but a particular lake I know in Norfolk in England, they've spent millions of pounds on one lake and decades of work trying to restore it to high condition, and failed. When it did return for some period, it flipped back again after a period of 2 years. So essentially what we're saying is once the state has gone into the degraded state, it's lost its ecosystem service provision, and it can be permanent. In fact, it usually is. So you mentioned fire. This is a tributary of the Amazon, and the picture we normally see from a plane in the Amazon is like that. But drought, caused by almost certainly climate change, is affecting the Amazon basin quite severely, and drought led to the drying out of the rainforest, and fire swept through, and that is the result. Now, we don't know whether that will be permanent, but typically the wind blows the dust around. The fertility of the soil goes very quickly in that sort of environment, and recovery, if it is possible, will take a long time. Okay, so the end of this one is undamaged ecosystems are more resilient. They're on that top line of that Z-shaped graph I showed, that's more stable and longer the more species there are. And if they're stressed, once they reach a certain point, they can flip if put under stress from external. And if the driver is increased to a certain point, it will flip anyway to a degraded state, and it will not go back again if the driver is reduced. It's a very important thing, because some ecosystems produce high quality ecosystem services for us, and they can't be reverted back to that state if they flip into degraded state, not without a lot of effort and money, and sometimes not then. Okay. And importantly, of course, the threshold for that regime shift is not known. Sometimes we don't know that the other shock that's occurring between the two vertical dashed lines is occurring. We don't know it's occurring. There's a lake that I worked on for 3 years that was subject to stress from herbicide, which it turned out that the yachting club, who didn't like the weeds tangling their boats, had applied the herbicide to the lake. We didn't know that was going to happen, but it then went into the degraded state, and it can't be brought back because it's an agricultural area, and you can't expect farmers to not put fertilizer on their land. They don't want it to run off their land either. It's expensive, but it does. Okay. So section 4, dependency on ecosystem services, should I say, on biodiversity. This in the chapter 2 that you've got corresponds to section 3 that goes through a range of ecosystem services and talks about what they're dependent on, where they're derived from. So the main things you need from this is the high quality provision of ecosystem services is linked to the ability of the ecosystems to function normally. And the more stressed they are, the more subject to human activities they are, the more degraded the ecosystem, the less it's going to produce ecosystem services. And of course, as we've just seen, it can flip to a totally degraded state. So a suite of ecosystem services are produced, a bundle of ecosystem services are produced by semi-natural and biodiverse systems. And when we have impacts on them, it leads to loss of services. That's what that section 3 says, and you'll be happy that this is a short section because I've encapsulated all of those things in section 3 into this one table. So I'm very pleased, because you won't be able to read it here, but I'm very pleased you can get hold of these slides. And you don't need to read it here either, because I've highlighted what I want to talk about. These ecosystem services on the left here, the ones listed in that section, depend upon or derive from wild relatives, wild species, ecosystems, forest, grassland, marine ecosystems, wild relatives, vegetation, marine forest, wild habitat, biodiversity, natural habitat, soil ecology, pollinator diversity. You get the picture. They are derived from the wild nature that Andrew Bamford and co. are talking about in that classic paper of 2002, Economic Reasons to Protect Wild Nature. I hope you've read it, it's on the list. These are the things that Andrew Bamford is arguing to protect, and they are the things that produce the ecosystem services. If you look in the fourth column, the things that threaten the provision of ecosystem services are population growth, land use, habitat loss, pollution, habitat fragmentation, land conversion to other uses, chemical agriculture, human expansion. You get the picture. And the last one is climate change. Climate change. It's pervasive. It affects the quality of our ecosystems, and that affects the ability of the ecosystems to provide the ecosystem services. And it's a very difficult thing to be able to keep those ecosystems wild, or keep enough area of land wild to provide those ecosystem services, whilst we're still maintaining high production of food and so on. And Pavan will tell you that in Western society, we waste 30% of the food that we grow anyway. Okay, so you'll be pleased to hear that that's the last bit of that section 4. And the lessons you need to learn from that are that we've got to learn how to manage our ecosystems so we don't degrade them, because that's how they produce the ecosystem services that we value. When we manipulate nature, we always degrade nature. And these are costly, so that's it. So section 5, the valuation of ecosystem services. In the back of that chapter, Charles Perrings wrote, "The market counts only the obvious services, not the building blocks that produce them." So it doesn't count the regulating ecosystem services, and it doesn't count the supporting ecosystem services, or even very much the aesthetic cultural services. Obviously there are tourism industries and so on which depend on it, but mostly it counts just the provisioning services, just those potatoes that the farmer wants to produce, because that's what we can sell in the market. The rest of it is indirect. But I won't go into these. If you read Andrew Bamford's paper, you'll get the other things. The important thing also to recognise is resilience thinking. We need to engender resilient thinking in our policy making, in our economics. We need to think about how to create resilience in ecosystems, and that usually means reducing our impacts on them. It's important to know that the value of the ecosystems that we're losing, the ecosystem services rather, that we're losing, the supporting ecosystem services, the regulating ecosystem services, are sometimes of greater value than the target provisioning ecosystem services that we're spending our efforts and money on producing. The potatoes themselves might not be worth as much money as all the climate regulation, the water regulation, and soil formation and so on, that the provision of those destroys. It's very important to learn that. The trade-offs that we went through before, it might mean that a farmer must be compensated for losing his high-end yields that we showed on that trade-off graph in order to preserve the provision of the regulating and supporting ecosystem services. So we need to obviously we can encourage farmers to manage ecosystems better so that they can get the regulating as well as the provisioning ecosystem services. But if it means foregoing those, it can be economically worthwhile to do so. It's important to know that economic and environmental sustainability are the same thing when you look at the sums. And lastly, I've put here that the market is a psychopath. And I put that because it has no conscience. The market doesn't consider externalities. It considers the price, what you can get, the maximization of yields and so on. And I've just put reference to this book, The Psychopath Test, because it explains that and it puts it into context of CEOs and things like that. But it's also a very funny book. I really recommend reading it. It's very easy to read. So have a look at that. So here we have the crux, the ecological worldview of Charles Krebs, the economic worldview of the late, great Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman said that effectively a company, the market the same, or a CEO, doesn't have to take notice of anything except the profits for shareholders. Charles Krebs said that economic worldview of Milton Friedman will be superseded this century by an ecological worldview that is looking at sustainability, looking at the ability to maintain ecosystems to provide the services that we need. So, who is right? The conventional economists will point to the fact that developed economies have better quality environments than developing economies. There are reasons for that. This is a graph of the usual rate of rise in GDP, about 3% a year if you give or take the odd recession or depression or downturn or whatever the politicians call it. It usually goes up at 3% a year. And that means that there'll be more money. And the politicians will tell you that the more money there is, the more we'll be able to afford to spend money on cleaning up the environment. And that tells me that they don't actually get it. And this next addition to this graph shows the costs of damage from extreme weather, which was rising with climate change, at between 7 and 10% a year. And if that trend continued, it didn't actually continue, it was a result of things like Katrina and so on that happened at the same time. If it had continued at that rate, the total costs of the damages from weather would have equaled total global production by about 2065. I don't know whether it will happen again. Maybe there'll be another bout of extreme weather damage, but luckily it didn't. But it does give you the message that costs from loss of regulating ecosystem services through damage to habitats or through the just being overwhelmed by the amount of, for example, carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere, they can never be paid for. GDP will never increase to the amount that we can pay to clean up the environment. So it means we've got to change the way we run the economy, and that's where the resistance lies. Now this is the lake that I was mentioning with a clear water state, and the other lake that was in the other picture was flowing into it. That's in Cheshire in the UK, Little Mere. And I've got that just to show you that the regulating and supporting, in fact, ecosystem services that I've got along the top there. Of those, the first four, that's the pristine ecosystem, the biodiversity within it and the contingency, the species redundancy and so on, the functional groups that lead to particular functions, ecosystem functionings, all those have cultural values, educational value, spiritual, aesthetic values to us, and they also contribute to the provision of ecosystem services which are of material benefit to humans, and we get our benefits from those ecosystem services directly. The next component is the valuation, which is the subject of this part. The valuation is providing us an economic means to justify the protection of all these, the first 5 things. The ecosystems themselves, the components of the ecosystem, the biodiversity, their functioning, and the ecosystem services. We've got to justify it economically because we don't regard, or the market, which is a psychopath, does not regard all those things, making life worthwhile, etc., as worthwhile in economic terms. These last 2, economic planning by governments, by multinational companies and so on, and legislation, government policy, they are the target for the valuation process. That's what we actually want to change. Now, the first lot we already know. We know inherently the value of ecosystems. We know them from our first slide where I projected ecosystem services onto you in a great sort of godlike manner. That we knew that already. And we know that the ecosystems are worth preserving and for their services. We just are still working out the detail for justification of them on economic terms so that we can present it to the market economy. If governments wanted to change economic planning and introduce legislation to protect those things, they could do so now. They can do it with things like revenue neutral carbon tax or environmental tax, which penalises unsustainable behaviour and rewards sustainable behaviour. And I've put this CMF, which is an Irish think tank, you can Google that, which has come up with this carbon maintenance fee to do that same system between countries, administered by the UN, I believe. It's worth looking at as a principle. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to convince people. The economic means to justify is merely so that we can convince people to take it seriously in the economy. And that means we've got to change the economy, as the subsequent lectures are going to focus on. So this is pretty well the last couple of slides. All you need to know about this is, to the right of the line, extensive types of agriculture have a far greater energy ratio. In other words, they produce more energy than they consume than it does in the more intensive forms to the left. And I just wanted to show you this bit. Greenhouse vegetables in winter. The example of this is a German study, found 575 calories of energy were required to produce 1 calorie of food energy if in greenhouse vegetables in winter. And I found a similar thing, probably not quite as bad as that, in my local supermarket. I'm not sure if you get Morrison's here, but Morrison's is a supermarket in England, and they sell Brussels sprouts, which are, I'm not sure if you know Brussels sprouts, they're like a mini cabbage. You have them for Christmas dinner. And they start getting scarce about January or something like that. And so what do Morrison's do? They import them from Australia, and they sell them 8 or something in a little sort of scrotum of 8 Brussels sprouts for £2.50 or £2.70, which is like $4 or something. And they sell those, and people buy it. That means, in the economic worldview, that makes sense. But it can only make sense in a mad worldview, the economic worldview. In an ecological worldview, that's insanity to do that. Because of that equation there, that's probably a worst case scenario. So to sum up the last section, how am I doing for time? Okay. Biodiversity can be regarded as a portfolio, investment portfolio, because increased biodiversity ensures us against loss of ecosystem services, because another species will come along and perform that same function that the lost one did. So that's the first thing. Again, to repeat that, environmental sustainability and economic sustainability should be the same thing. They are the same thing if you look at the figures and work it out and take care to. Our natural capital is depleted. This is going to be covered in other lectures anyway. But because our natural capital is depleted, all the things that keep us comfortable, our social, political, economic well-being, are compromised, and in fact they are impermanent because of the depletion of the natural capital. So I'll leave you with this one. This is the G8 leaders a few years ago planting trees in Japan, And I think they were persuaded to by things like the TEEB, although this I think was before the TEEB. But hopefully letters are going to come down now. Yeah, so I'm going to leave you with that. Okay. Now where did I get that from? I got that from the idea that Nicholas Stern, the hard-nosed chief economist of the World Bank, was charged by Gordon Brown, they're all Tony Blair maybe, to look into the economics of climate change, and he produced the Stern Review, which you're probably familiar with. And in doing so, that converted him from a disinterested economist, I hope I'm not doing him down there, to someone who now campaigns for controlling our emissions of greenhouse gases. And that was because he looked at the figures, he looked at the sums, and that's what you're doing, and that's what we're doing with the TEEB. So hence that statement, and that's it. Thank you very much.